The aim of this lecture is to present a complex of two keyboard manuscripts that originated in Royal Prussia during the first decades of the 17th century. They have been known mainly as the Oliva Tablatures, or the first and larger of the two as the Braunsberg Tablature. Both manuscripts form a set because they were created by the same two principal scribes. The first book originated at Braunsberg and was completed at Oliva. The second manuscript is only a fragment of what was probably the second book. This second book was a continuation of the first one and originated at Oliva. For this reason, I propose to call both manuscripts Braunsberg-Oliva Tablatures. This name will also appear in my complete critical edition of them that is going to appear in 2021 in the series Fontes Musicae in Polonia. The Braunsberg-Oliva Tablatures are now housed in the Wróblewski Library of the Lithuanian Academy of Sciences in Vilnius. Until 1831, they were kept in the library of the Cistercian monastery at Oliva, now part of Gdańsk, Danzig in Poland. After the dissolution of the monastery, they were moved to the Prussian State Archive in Königsberg. During the Second World War, the library collections of the city were mostly evacuated, and the tablatures probably went to the castle Lochstedt close to Pilau, now Bałtysk in the Kaliningrad Oblast of the Russian Federation. There, they were found shortly after 1945 by Lithuanian scholars who were organizing expeditions to rescue valuable objects of art and culture that had survived from the ruins of Königsberg and from the East Prussia. The fortunate existence of the tablatures was publicly announced only in 1990. The first, larger tablature forms a parchment-bound volume with 171 folios. The title page reveals the possessor and main scribe of the manuscript, a certain Jacobus Apfel, who is described as Studiosus Wormditensis. This inscription tells us that Apfel came from Wormdit, which is now Orneta, in Warmia, Poland, and that he was a student. Apfel's name can be found on the lists of members of the Marian congregation that existed at the Jesuit college in Braunsberg, now Braniewo, in Warmia. The congregation gathered all the students of the college, and Apfel's accession is dated 17th of June 1612. Therefore, it is likely that he had been already in the college for a few years before that date. Most probably, he began his education in the boarding school for poor youths that had existed at the college since 1582. This institution gained a decidedly musical profile in the first years of the 17th century at the latest. Such music schools, as we could call them, were created in many Jesuit colleges in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Boys were taught singing and playing various instruments, and formed an ensemble that performed in the church. Older students gave instruction to younger boys, and in this way paid off their own education. At the top of the title page there is another inscription that begins with the words Liber Tabulatura. Next to them there was a date, now unfortunately invisible due to the loss of paper during the restoration of the volume. The date was read as 1619 by Alexander Lubomski, who examined the book before the Second World War. This date has been commonly accepted as the starting point of the tablature, yet there is one more date inside the book on folio 14. What we can see on a photo is clearly 13 Septembris and two last digits of the year. They are, however, very faded. Jan Janca read the first digit as 2, and the year 1620 would nicely correspond with the date on the title page. When I inspected the manuscript in Vilnius, it became obvious that the first digit cannot be other than 1, and the date is therefore 1610. That moves back the history of the source almost by a decade. The date 1619 on the title page does not then refer to the starting point. Rather, it must document another important event. That could have been either a completion of the manuscript or, in my opinion more likely, the move of Apfel from Braunsberg to Oliva. In another list of Braunsberg students, next to Apfel's name, there is an additional inscription saying Ingressus Monasterium Olivense. That is, that he entered the Cistercian monastery at Oliva. That was a popular direction among the Braunsberg students. The monastery is known both to have been sending their monks to the college and to have recruited new monks from the students. Unfortunately, the exact date of Apfel's accession to the monastery cannot be determined. He is first mentioned in 1624 as deacon, but the monastery documentation from the earlier years is incomplete. It seems that he soon stopped playing the organ. During later years, he is referred to as infirmarius, that is, a monk who took care of the ill brethren. That, by the way, caused his death in 1653. During the plague, he looked after sick monks and became infected himself. This course of events is reflected in our manuscripts. The bound volume was begun in 1610, probably soon after Apfel entered the Braunsberg College. This volume has been prepared and bound in advance at the college. The paper used for it is a high-quality paper that was produced in the mill of Emanuel Züchlin in Lauingen, a town in Bavaria. That is very unusual because this paper has not been recognized in any document created in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Interestingly, however, it was used for another keyboard tablature, the manuscript dated 1620 and now kept in Uppsala, Sweden, but created at the Jesuit College in Riga. It seems then that the Jesuits who worked in the northern part of the Commonwealth and who mostly spoke German had strong ties to their brethren in Bavaria and evidently imported paper from there. The Bavarian paper was formed into 15 gatherings of various sizes that altogether gave 150 folios. Jacobus Apfel started entering the music both from the front and from the middle of the book at the same time. Possibly the section that he started in the middle was intended to be devoted to strictly liturgical music, while the first section was filled with whatever other material was to be copied, intabulations of motets, lieder, chansons and madrigals, preambula and fugues. It is also likely that there was a third section that he began soon thereafter, one devoted to dances. This original plan was not carried out consistently. The middle section soon was littered with non-liturgical pieces. Some strictly liturgical compositions appear in the first section. Dances form a compact group that seems to have been filled in during an extended period of time, but there are also individual dances or small groups of them at other places in the manuscript. Some of them were evidently added at empty places that remained after writing longer pieces. It is very likely that it took a few years to complete these parts of the volume, especially if Apfel indeed stayed at Braunsberg for 8 or even 9 years. His musical education must have been rather thorough, given the array of musical genres, both sacred and secular, that he became acquainted with. We shall return to that point later. In these Braunsberg parts of the tablature, we can also see many sentences and proverbs entered between the compositions, both in Latin and in German. We could also see them on the title page. They range from classical authors to popular sayings and belonged to the standard education. We can also see Apfel's handwriting evolve in the course of filling in the book. It seems that at Oliva, Apfel continued writing in the manuscript for some time. One large group of works that he copied probably soon after his move to the monastery is the corpus of motets by Andreas Hackenberger, the Kapellmeister of St. Mary's in Danzig, from his collection Sacri Modulorum Concentus of 1615. That date, by the way, gives a terminus postquem for Apfel's copies. Next to the titles of motets in this group, there are letters and numbers. This reference system is known to have been used in many church libraries. In this case, letters denote concrete sets of part books, either printed or handwritten, and numbers refer either to folios or to numbers of compositions in the part books. This system allows the organist to identify the works copied into his tablature within part books that were used by singers and instrumentalists whom he accompanied during the services. Letters and numbers do not appear anywhere in the Braunsberg part of the volume, but they are quite consistently used for the pieces written toward the end of the book, as well as in the small fragment of the second tablature. Therefore, it is safe to assume that the letters and numbers refer to the part books used at Oliva, now unfortunately lost. Interestingly, the group of Hackenberger's motets was divided by Apfel into two sections. He began writing in the last section of the book, and then probably realized that the 9 empty folios that he still had in the volume would not be enough to fit the rest of the pieces. Therefore, he moved to another group of empty folios that was left in the middle of the book, just before the middle section that he started early at Braunsberg. There he filled 9 folios out of 21. At this point, or soon thereafter, it became clear that the volume is almost full and there are still many pieces to be copied. Evidently, the repertoire available and performed at Oliva was different from that collected at Braunsberg. Apfel then decided to enlarge the volume by additional gatherings of paper. He removed all empty folios that were left at this stage, hence the original foliation has now gaps. Then, having no access to the Bavarian paper anymore, he took another paper, made at the local mill of Heinrich Probstli, and formed 4 gatherings, 8 folios each. He put the additional gatherings in the middle of the last original gathering and sewed them into the volume. In the effect, last 2 folios of the book have the original Bavarian paper with original foliation crossed out and replaced by new numbers. There was also a 3rd folio of the original paper at the end of the book, which is now lost, and the last piece is now incomplete. After this operation, the book became too thick for its original binding. The back cover seems now too short, because a part of it was swallowed by the thicker spine. The removal of empty folios and addition of the new gatherings gave 20 extra folios for new pieces. But soon after enlarging the volume, Apfel evidently stopped copying music. Exactly at the junction of the 2 kinds of paper, a new scribe appears. He wrote virtually all the remaining music in the book. In this last section, the work titles are written in red ink. This calligraphic handwriting is so formal that it cannot be ascribed to a concrete person, but some editions in ordinary handwriting resemble Apfel's hand very closely. It seems likely, then, that Apfel supervised copying of this part of the tablature and wrote the titles. Maybe he was teaching another monk to play the organ and eventually to take over his job. One also wonders why the last part of the tablature looks so neat when compared with the earlier sections. I think there is a connection with the tablature volumes that were created at Pelplin at about the same time in the 1620s. Those lavish fur copies would have served as models how a tablature volume may look like, whereas the red ink could be intended to show the superiority of Oliva. There is also a very strong connection of repertoire. 36 out of 57 works in the Oliva part are also copied into the Pelplin volumes. The two Cistercian monasteries were closely tied by personal contacts, and they must have also shared the music they possessed. When almost every corner of the Braunsberg Oliva volume was filled with entries, there was no possibility to expand the book further. We do not know exactly whether another book was prepared and bound, or the scribes started copying on loose gatherings that were intended to form a book at a later stage. A bound volume seems more likely. Lubomski saw these materials in Königsberg and did not report anything that would point to an unusual character of the second tablature. The gathering that is preserved now is clearly a continuation of another gathering now lost. On the first page there is a fragment of a composition that was partly written through the opening between the two fascicles, and probably the preserved gathering was the last one. The final page is left empty, and the last work is copied by yet another scribe, whom we obviously also cannot identify. It is difficult to establish the dates of creation of the Oliva part of the first volume and of the fragment of the second volume. The handwriting of the second scribe, who took the copying over from Apfel, shows no visible changes, and at least in the material known to us, there is no datable composition written after 1617. It is thus safe to assume that both volumes were completed in the 1620s, maybe even quite soon after Apfel came to Oliva. The uncommon history of the manuscripts is fascinating in itself, but equally interesting are their contents. There are 328 music entries in the big tablature. Of these, 2 entries are fragmentary copies of compositions written in full elsewhere in the manuscript. 12 pieces are written twice, 2 pieces are entered 3 times, and on a single page with staff notation there are examples for transposition. Almost all pieces written more than once are short dances. Altogether, there are 308 different works transmitted in the tablature. The small fragment of the second manuscript contains 8 pieces. Of these, 1 is a small fragment and 1 is left unfinished by the scribe. In both manuscripts, 84 works are ascribed to 30 different composers. In the course of research, it became possible to identify many further pieces. Now, there are 174 identified works that are attributed to 60 different composers. The forthcoming edition is going to contain an inventory that will allow quick insight into the diversity of the repertoire. This imposing amount of music comes partly from the local tradition, but the majority was imported from Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, France and England, mostly via prints and partly through manuscript transmission. It is important to realize that a lot of this music was apparently available in some form at the Jesuit College in Braunsberg, a small provincial town in Warmia. The most popular composer there, like everywhere else, was unquestionably Orlando di Lasso, represented by 22 works. Almost all of them, as well as all 19 works of Hans Leo Hassler, were copied at Braunsberg. On the other hand, 20 works by the Danzig Kapellmeister Andreas Hakenberger were entered at Oliva. Among the larger corpuses of works by single composers, 7 pieces by Jacobus Handel, 7 pieces of Giovanni Battista Cocciola, the Kapellmeister of the Bishop of Varmia, 6 pieces by Orazio Vecchi, and 5 pieces by Petrus de Drusina, the organist at St. Mary's in Elbing, were copied at Braunsberg, while the corpus of 8 pieces by Gregorio Zucchini was entered at Oliva. Of the 5 compositions by Giovanni Croce, 4 were copied at Braunsberg and 1 at Oliva. All the remaining composers are represented by 1 to 4 works each. This repertoire can be broadly divided into 3 large groups: works with text incipit, instrumental works in free genres, and dances. The last 2 groups belong entirely to the Braunsberg part of the big tablature. The great majority of the works with text incipit are intabulations. Their exact number is, however, impossible to establish because not all compositions have been identified. And among the pieces that are not known from other sources, some can be organ settings of liturgical melodies. In my previous lecture, I talked about the close affinity of vocal and instrumental counterpoint of that time, and the vague border between vocal and instrumental music. The problems we encounter here are a good example of this situation. The identified vocal compositions copied into our tablatures come mainly from prints that were issued between 1543 and 1617. The majority of them are pieces with sacred texts set for 1 to 10 voices, but predominantly for 4 to 8 voices. Smaller performing forces are more frequent in the Braunsberg part, which is, however, more focused on the older 16th century repertoire. In the Oliva part, there are more works printed already in the 17th century, but on the whole, the repertoire is rather traditionally oriented, and even in this part, the motets by Orlando di Lasso or Jacob Mailand, copied by the scribe, were already over 50 years old. Secular music entered at Braunsberg amounts to 40 compositions for 3, 4, and 5 voices, among them Italian canzoni, canzonette, and madrigals, German lieder, French chanson, and 1 English ballet. Not counted here are sacred contrafacta. It may seem rather strange that such an array of secular music was available at the Jesuit college. The popularity of such light pieces, including also dances, must have been so big that it was difficult to pretend they did not exist. However, the common strategy of the Church was to use them with religious texts. Some examples can indeed be found in the Braunsberg manuscript. The same music appears twice in the tablature with 2 different text incipits: Maria Virgo Assumpta est Celos and Sudir Herr Christe. But in fact the music was written by Jacob Regnard to the Italian text Se notte giorni. Jacobus Appel became conscious of this fact at some point because he wrote the inscription Se not under the religious titles. In the Jesuit tablature from Riga, the one that uses the same paper as the Braunsberg part of our manuscript, there is a considerable number of secular pieces, but all of them have Latin religious text incipits. In fact, we know very little about the circumstances of music instruction at Jesuit colleges at this early stage of their existence. Ideally, music was supposed to be taught by non-Jesuits, presumably by laymen. If such was the case at Braunsberg, secular pieces with their proper texts could have easily been slipped into the repertoire. But, on the other hand, everything was censored, at least from time to time. As a result, some of the most scandalizing titles were hidden by small pieces of paper pasted on them. Jan Jansa, who examined the tablature in the early 1990s, still saw some of them. Now all the titles are uncovered, but there are visible traces of glue in their places. Perhaps after a few such interventions, Apfel realized that writing about love and girls was too dangerous, and in some later entries he skipped the problematic titles altogether, leaving only the names of the composers, or nothing at all. Among the works with Latin text incipits that have no attribution and are not known from other sources, there are some that may belong to the local tradition cultivated in Warmia or more specifically at the Jesuit college in Braunsberg. Titles like Similicet immeritus, Quesitus et repertus est, or Omnia sidereo are not beginnings of any liturgical texts. They point to spiritual poetry or even to classical authors. These texts could have been set to music by Jesuits and sung by the college students. There is a considerable number of carols and other Christmas pieces that have settings unique to the Braunsberg source and may come from the tradition of singing at the nativity plays. 2 German songs, Jesu König der Ehren and Jesu Fronleichnam schon, are simple settings of melodies whose only source is a songbook called Himmlischer Harfenklang that was printed in Braunsberg. Many of the same unique pieces are also present in another, earlier tablature, now held in Uppsala, Sweden, that is very likely to have also originated at Braunsberg in the 1580s. For those who watched my earlier lecture, I have called that source the older Braunsberg tablature. The considerable number of intabulations in our tablature allows us to discern a lot of techniques used to transcribe a vocal piece into the tablature. In the Braunsberg part, there are 15 ornamented intabulations that could be used as solo keyboard music and as examples of this art. Diminutions can run through all the voices, often in a very virtuosic way, in the alla bastarda style. In other pieces, they are applied only to the outer voices. The rest of the intabulations is not ornamented at all, but the degree of their fidelity to their vocal models varies greatly. The vocal compositions may be copied in full or reduced to a lesser number of voices, down to 2 outer voices only. Double choir works are typically reduced either to the outer voices of both choirs or to some sort of reduction for 4 voices, occasionally augmented to thicker textures. There is only one instance of a double choir piece copied in full, and one other instance of copying only the material of the first choir. In this case, the organ probably served as replacement of the first choir, and the second choir was sung on or played on other instruments. There is no place here to analyze all kinds of arrangements found in the Braunsberg intabulations, but it is important to realize that they all served very practical goals. They allowed the organist either to participate in a vocal performance or to play the motets as solo music, also with improvised ornamentation. In the Oliva part, all intabulations are full copies of the vocal pieces. Double choir music is written in such a way that one can exactly see the choir blocks. We can also see that as in many tablatures, letters and rhythmic symbols above them are grouped into small units that may be called bar cells, and their length is here always a semibreve, that is, a whole note. Any values that exceed a given bar cell are divided into 2 smaller values, so that the bar cell is always rhythmically closed. For a player reading the tablature, it is a welcome relief, because it is not necessary to follow complicated syncopations and remember what a value in the previous cell was. We may assume that a skilled player who knew the style could add ties himself in many rather obvious places, But this kind of notation tells us very clearly that even full tablature scores like these had a very practical purpose, and they were not created just to store the pieces for later use. Many copies from the Oliva part have space below each system of tablature left for the text, like in the Pelplin volumes, where the text is indeed written in most cases under the lowest voice. Unlike in Pelplin, however, here in the Oliva part, the texts were written in just a few cases. The texts were apparently not so necessary. They could help the organist follow a piece and phrase properly. Maybe they would also make rehearsals easier. But their presence is not connected to the possibility of creating vocal parts from the tablature. In the copy of Viadana's solo motet Dum complerentur, the words are written hastily and often slightly misplaced. That is enough for the organist, but certainly not very clear for the singer. And this piece shows explicitly that the tablature copy of the bass line, which is, by the way, identical to the vocal line whenever the voice is singing, was intended for the organist's use. Fragments that are not sung are marked in red, often with inscriptions forte or passus forte. This is an instruction to change registration or move to another manual for these fragments. Instrumental works in three genres constitute a group of 23 pieces. There are 4 preambula, including 2 ascribed to Petrus de Drusina, 1 untitled preambulum that might have been written either late at Braunsberg or early at Oliva, 5 canzonas, 6 pieces called fuga, and 3 extended cadential formulas labeled clausula, as well as 4 other works with peculiar titles that most probably also belong to this group: Lemma, Musa, Macula, and Melos. Many of these pieces are anonymous and have not been identified in any other source. They may come from a local tradition, like the works by Petrus de Drusina or Diomedes Cato. Others have attributions or have been identified as works of Italian and South German composers. Both Gabrielis, Costanzo Antoniati, Claudio Merulo, and the Hassler brothers, Hans Leo and Kaspar. This corpus of pieces is highly interesting. Only one of them, a canzone by Andrea Gabrieli, was available in print. The rest was transmitted only in manuscripts, and they do not appear in other sources from Central Europe. 2 canzonas, one by Giovanni Gabrieli and one by Costanzo Antoniati, were printed in the 1617 Volz tablature in Basel, but the Braunsberg texts are different in details and most likely earlier. This important corpus of keyboard canzonas could have been imported directly from Augsburg, just like the paper for the tablature. Hans Leo Hassler worked in Augsburg from 1585 to 1600. He was a student of Andrea Gabrieli in Venice and certainly had easy access to the Italian repertoire that was not available in official prints. His brother Kaspar also worked in Augsburg in the years 1587 and 88. It may be no coincidence that most of Hans Leo Hassler's vocal works copied into the Braunsberg part of the tablature come from his Augsburg prints as well. This way of transmission of Italian and South German instrumental music into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has not been known before, and is a welcome addition to our very incomplete picture of how such music was imported into our country. The Braunsberg part is a very important source of dance music. It transmits as many as 68 different dances. This number is extremely high if we compare it with other sources from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Of course, the definition of what actually may be a dance is not very sharp. Some dances were equipped with texts. The German composer Valentin Hausmann collected dances during his trip to Poland and Prussia in 1598 to 1600, and then edited them with his own texts that became popular in Germany. Many simple vocal pieces could have also served as dances. One of the Paduanas in the Braunsberg tablature is actually a ballet by Thomas Morley, the famous My Bonnie Lassie Smileth. We may then suspect that in the older Braunsberg tablature, some of the pieces labeled Italicum could be used as dance music. But, strictly speaking, of all the sources between 1570 and 1630, only the Danzig Intavolatura contains one Paduana. Against this background, the group of 68 dances is really impressive. Moreover, the majority of the dances seem to be local. There are very few concordances with other sources. Morley is one of the few spectacular exceptions. 12 dances appear in the prints of Valentin Hausmann, but as I said, Hausmann himself collected them in Prussia, so most likely the transmission in the Braunsberg tablature is independent. The group of dances is not coherent. Many of them are just in two voices, soprano and bass, a framework presumably to be filled with some harmony. These are mostly copied in one section of the manuscript that was probably intended to contain dances only. Some of them could have been written in small groups. Other dances, scattered throughout the manuscript, have full textures of 4 to 5 voices. Of these, some are simple settings that could have been copied from instrumental part books, while others have a fully developed keyboard texture with complex ornamentation. They seem to come from a pen and fingers of a professional musician. A few dances, on the other hand, are very amateurish settings, full of parallel fifths and octaves and incurable dissonant clashes. On the whole, the Braunsberg Oliva Tablatures seem to constitute a highly interesting material for further study and research. The complex history of the manuscripts and the diversity of repertoire allow us a really detailed glimpse into the musical practice at two important centers in the northern part of the Commonwealth. The manuscripts provide us with a lot of excellent works that have not been known before and belong to the Central European tradition, still largely neglected in the textbooks on the history of music. And the compositions notated in the tablatures provoke questions concerning their performance practice, eventually leading us to rethink our approach to keyboard music and keyboard playing around 1600 and shortly thereafter.